One evening last spring, Frank Gaffney excitedly called me, saying he had just seen a wonderful film that tells an important story. He said the film was called Obsession. I told him that by coincidence, I was in the middle of watching it right then. Since that time, we have collaborated in producing a seminar that we call Democracy Under Attack. We've concluded that Obsession, along with his book War Footing, would cut through the media's political correctness and wake America up to the dangers that confront us. In the film Obsession, we identify the problem as Islamofascism, and with Frank's powerful book War Footing, 10 steps America must take to prevail in the war for the free world, we learn how to understand the challenge and how to win the war. Today I'm honored to introduce the author of War Footing, Frank J. Gaffney, Jr. He is also the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, a Washington, D.C. think tank. The center has been used internationally as a major resource for timely and penetrating analysis of foreign and defense policies. Under President Reagan, Frank served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. He writes a weekly column for the Washington Times, for townhall.com, and for jewishworldreview.com. In addition, he appears often on national and international TV and radio news programs and has been widely published in all major news periodicals. Prepare to be challenged by our distinguished speaker, Frank J. Gaffney, Jr.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to be here, and especially on tonight, a night when we, of course, are thinking and I'm sure very introspectively mulling over the events of the past 5 years, which began for us, certainly in this country, on 9/11, but that in fact is part of a larger war that has been going on for a long time. And what I propose to do tonight is talk a little bit about that longer war after you see the film, which I think very eloquently addresses the question, why did 9/11 happen? And helps us, I think, anticipate what may be in front of us in this long war, especially if we fail to take steps that are clearly warranted by the circumstances described in the film. Let's go to the videotape. Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West.
Radical Islam is at war now with the West.
When I saw the second airplane hit, I knew jihad has come to America.
They wish to strike down the West.
Every single country in the world is dealing with this on one level or another.
USA! USA! UK! UK!
You
see that the Thais are dealing with it, the Europeans are dealing with it in Madrid, the Russians are dealing with it in Chechnya, the British are dealing with it in London and in Manchester.
What makes Allah happy? Allah is happy when the Kafirs get killed.
They see all of these not as specific wars, but as fronts in a global jihad.
فلا سبيل إلى العزة إلا بالجهاد.
الجهاد في سبيل الله. الجهاد في سبيل الله.
I think the world, despite the number of attacks in various countries, is still in denial. They don't want to believe that someone has declared war on them.
Radical Islamic proponents believe that the West has been engaged in a conspiracy to subjugate Islam.
أما الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بصراحة هي تريد طمس هويتنا الدينية.
به جنگ مردم عراق اومدن علاوه بر اینکه به جنگ اسلام اصلا اومدن.
What they are saying is the United States is a threat, is a danger to them, is trying to dominate them, is trying to turn the whole world into America, and this is what they are telling their people they have to fight against.
And therefore, the West needs to be defeated one way or another.
من يملك أن يقول كلمة في الجهاد الحق هذا ضد المحتل ويقدم بيوت ويقدم شباب وتضرب رقاب وتنسف جماجم. هذا خط النصر والشهادة والتضحية.
One of the main ways they get the people to be willing to fight and endanger their lives and to hate the West is to present the war as an act of self-defense.
So in order for you to do jihad, you have to find a good reason. So the best reason is we're defending ourselves. There is an enemy out there who wants to get us.
أمريكا هذه الإدارة الأمريكية هي عدو.
America wants to get us.
الولايات المتحدة عدوة العرب والمسلمين والإنسانية، وعلى كل إنسان بما يقدر ويستطيع أن يقاوم هذا العدو.
Nothing could be done wrong by Arabs. It's always the West.
If you want to get people to fight, you have to make them think that there's a threat and then they're in danger.
آمریکا در کمین نشستند و تا نابودی کاملتان از شما دست بر نخواهند داشت. سریعاً قیام کنید که جهان ایمن از صیاد نیست.
This propaganda throughout the Arab world has a very significant effect on the adult population, on the children growing up.
أنا يعني أتمنى لو بوش يموت بالنار، ويعني خاطر أروح شارون وأذبح بالمسدس وأطعنه بالسيف، لأن مثل ما هو يسوي حق المسلمين وحق فلسطين. أقول حق بوش إنه هو خنزير وإن شاء الله يا رب يموت. شكرا.
A child isn't born hating. A child has to be taught to hate. A child has to be taught to fear.
The main theme in most of the Arab media is hostility to Israel and the United States and the West.
It recruits a lot of terrorists.
وشعارنا الذي رفعناه ولا نخشى أن نكرره في كل عام الموت لأمريكا.
As a child, I attended Gaza elementary schools. And we were taught that jihad is a religious holy war for the sake of Allah. That's what it is. To conquer the word for Allah. That is jihad.
These are actual scenes broadcast on Arab television.
التجاوز. لا بد من أن نقيم أنفسنا على دين الله عز وجل وعلى شرع الله سبحانه وتعالى. لا بد أن نربي أبناءنا تربية على حب الجهاد في سبيل الله، حب القتال في سبيل الله.
Daily, my classmates would recite poetry, jihadist poetry. And when they recited it, they were crying. They were wishing shahada, to be shaheed, to die as a martyr, to die in jihad.
إذا احتفظت على باب القدس أصبحت فدائيا، أصبحت فدائيا بزي مقاتلي، بزي مقاتلي، بزي مقاتلي. وشكرا. برافو برافو برافو.
And now the world is reaping. These eggs are hatching, and what's coming out is literally something that comes out of Nazi Germany. The same as in Nazi Germany, the Boy Scouts in Nazi Germany, we had the youth. The youth was being robbed from being youth. The same thing is happening now again. History is repeating itself.
I was a very intense believer in the Nazi ideology. And I know what a supreme dedication to an ideology can do.
From an early age, Alphonse Heck was influenced by the Nazi worldview.
It is absolutely correct to say if you can't learn from the events of Nazi Germany, you will not be able to grasp the true intent of the danger of the radical Muslim world today. You're simply hiding.
History has an unfortunate habit of always repeating itself.
The fanatic Muslim world and Hitler both agreed that no ideology can exist beyond theirs. It's all-encompassing.
A secular dogma like Nazism is less dangerous than this Islamofascism that we see today. It's less dangerous because Islamofascism has a religious twist to it. It says God the Almighty ordered you to do this, not the Führer, you know. So it is way more dangerous. It's trying to grow itself in 55 Muslim states. So potentially you could have a success rate of several Nazi Germanys if these people get their way.
They've been very clear about it. They're the same as Hitler's goals, you know. Kill all the Jews, crush the democracies, destroy Western civilization.
They want to defeat the West. They want to defeat Christianity. They want to defeat Judaism.
Islam is superior than the Jews, than the Christians, than the Buddhists, than the Hindus. The only deen Allah accepts is Al-Islam. And whoever seek any other deen apart from Islam will never be accepted. And the Christians are kafirs. And you may say to yourself, no, they're innocent. No kafir is innocent.
Two blasts just minutes apart, outside two churches in Baghdad, as those inside worshipped.
and you too will meet your destruction, because Allah's religion will prevail on this earth.
Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I am the president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and lead author of a new book called War Footing: 10 Steps America Must Take to Prevail in the War for the Free World. We use the term war for the free world because we believe that more accurately describes the nature of the conflict in which we find ourselves. Specifically, that nations all over, most especially, of course, the United States, but also other freedom-loving countries like Israel, are under assault from basically the same source, namely a new political ideology, a totalitarian movement. We call it Islamofascism, to distinguish it from the practice of the religion of Islam by the vast majority of the world's Muslims. And recognizing that this political movement, like other totalitarian ideologies, has in mind power, not faith. To be sure, faith is used as a sort of cover, if you will, or a means of penetrating Western societies, most especially, that are very tolerant of religious freedom. But it really, at the end of the day, is still about domination. First and foremost, people of the Muslim faith, who are being slaughtered in larger numbers by the Islamofascists even than non-Muslims. But then in due course, you will see, naturally, that totalitarian movements seek to dominate the world as a whole, much as the Nazis did, much as the Bolsheviks and ultimately the communists tried to do. These ideological movements seek to control a smaller population and then extend that control. When you understand that that is the complexion of the war, and that this ideological movement is being made vastly more dangerous to us and to freedom-loving people everywhere by the support it is enjoying from states that sponsor Islamofascism. Some of them Islamofascists themselves, notably Saudi Arabia, a country we're often told is an ally of the West. In point of fact, it is the principal enabler of Islamofascism in the world today. Another one, of course, is the Shiite Islamofascist regime in Iran. They too are enabling, through enormous infusions of cash and intelligence support and terrorist training and the like, Islamofascism's spread and its efforts to assault the free world. Beyond these two manifestly Islamofascist regimes, unfortunately, there are several others that are not Islamists themselves, and yet that are making common cause with the Islamofascists in order, I would argue, to weaken the nations they perceive to be their natural foes. In this category, I would put Vladimir Putin's Russia, Communist China, and on a smaller scale, but with great ambitions, Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. What we are looking at, I believe, as a result of this combination of forces, the Islamofascist movement, their Islamist state sponsors, and the regimes that are increasingly totalitarian themselves and that are making common cause with the others, is a dynamic, multifaceted, and truly global challenge to the security, to the freedom, and to the prosperity of those of us in the free world. If that is indeed what we're up against, and the stakes as a result, are as high as I'm suggesting, it clearly behooves us to be doing more than we are doing at the moment to wage and win this war for the free world. So war footing is first and foremost about understanding the nature of the enemy and what makes it tick and what can be done given what makes it tick and who it is to defeat it. And then lays out what the steps are that in some cases individual citizens, in other cases organizations or communities, certainly constituents, can do to try to adopt programs and policies and capabilities that will enable this country and other freedom-loving people to prevail over these enemies. We use the term war footing to describe collectively these steps. By that we mean that if the country is once again challenged by a totalitarian ideology bent on our destruction, as was true in Nazi Germany, and I believe true of Soviet communism, that we need to do as we've done in the past, which is to mobilize this country in order to meet this danger, to bring to bear all of the talents and energies, the resources and capabilities at our disposal in order to ensure that not only for our generation, but for those of our children and grandchildren, we are able to assure the survival, indeed the prevailing of the free world over these various adversaries. So what are these steps? There are 10 of them. The first we've talked about is knowing who the enemy is. The second one is most obvious because we are, after all, in the midst of combat operations against some of these Islamofascists and their allies. And that is supporting the military. And there are a number of ways in which we can do that. I would suggest 3 are particularly important. The first is to really support the troops by ensuring that they have the wherewithal, the equipment most especially, they need not only to wage today's fights, but to be in a position to deal with those of the future. By being properly equipped, history tells us, we may be able to deter conflict. But at the very least, we want to ensure that we've not so focused our energies and our resources on today's warfare and what it takes to defeat enemies like those we confront in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we're incapable of dealing with potentially far more formidable adversaries in the future. We need to ensure that the troops who operate that equipment are properly trained. And this means being able to use facilities in this country, ranges and the like, that enable them to actually have the skills and expertise they need if they are engaged in combat to successfully use the tools we've given them. And finally, it's about the people. It's not enough just to have equipment and to provide training. You also need to have the best people you can. And here again, I think every one of us has a role to play in communicating to the young people of America that it is very important. It is not only laudable, but it is necessary for them to be serving their country in uniform, and if need be, to put themselves in harm's way for all of us. Those are 3 steps that I think can really support the troops and ensure that they can do the jobs assigned to them, which have generically one thing in common. We want those military operations in which we are engaged to be offensively oriented. It is vastly better to be fighting this nation's wars someplace else rather than contending with terrorists or their friends here in our own country. The other part of this that is critically important to the success of our military, of course, is intelligence. That those who are fighting this country's wars have the best intelligence available. And that requires a number of different things, not least of which is, in today's world, and that likely to persist for some time, having human resources, spies capable of penetrating closed societies and eliciting information they would not let us have. This is something we've not done very well at in the recent past, and it has made it more difficult for us to do the jobs militarily and in other ways that we must do in this war for the free world. The rest of the steps that we are recommending as part of a mobilized America, a war footing for winning the war for the free world, are not military in character. And it's very important, I think, to appreciate that there are a host of things we can do that do not require us to invest the lives of our young people and enormous national treasure. These fall into 4 generic categories. The first of these is what we call economic and financial security measures. They constitute basically 2 means of trying to do a single purpose. This is arguably the first time in the history of the world that one party to a conflict has underwritten the operations of both sides. And that's true in 2 respects. One, in the enormous transfer of wealth that we've made to countries that are at best unstable and in many cases downright hostile to us, in the form of payments for oil, most of which we use to operate the transportation sector of this economy. We believe and have recommended in War Footing a blueprint for implementing a strategy for weaning ourselves, if not entirely, then substantially, from our dependence upon oil as a national security imperative. The essence of this blueprint is affording something we don't currently have in the transportation sector of our economy, namely fuel choice. The opportunity, the ability to use alternative fuels to gasoline or diesel, both derived from oil. Specifically, we recommend greatly increasing both the number of vehicles that can use ethanol and methanol and even electricity as transportation fuels, and the availability of such fuels as alternatives to oil. And there are some very practical steps we believe can be taken and should be taken, again, as a national security imperative. The second major way in which we are transferring wealth and thereby enabling our enemies is through investments we make in companies that are partnered with our terrorist foes and their state sponsors. Specifically, there are about 440 publicly traded companies that invest in or otherwise do business with countries like Iran, Syria, Sudan, Libya, North Korea, and until recently, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. At the Center for Security Policy, we did a study that tried to get just a sense of the magnitude of the investments being made by American investors in such companies. And we looked at a cross-section of the U.S. capital markets comprised of about 100 public pension funds representing public beneficiaries like firemen, police officers, other first responders, state and local government officials, teachers, military personnel. And we discovered that just looking at those 100 roughly public pension funds all across America, approximately $188 billion was being invested in companies doing business with our terrorist foes. Not all of that money, of course, was actually going into these countries, but a significant portion was. We estimated about $73 billion was actually translating into investments in infrastructure, energy, telecommunications, and the like in countries like Iran and Syria and Sudan and so on. We think that one of the things a mobilized America can and should do is say to these sorts of foreign-owned and operated companies, you can do business with our terrorist sponsoring enemies, or you can do business with us. But you can't do both. And I think if forced to choose, most of these companies would recognize that their interests, as well as, I would hope, their loyalties, should lie with those of us in the free world, and thereby reducing their investments and thereby reducing the amounts of money that would be available, again, to the people who sponsor Islamofascism and other forms of terror around the world. The second generic category that we describe in War Footing involves what we call the Homeland Security issue. And there are three subsets to that. Obviously, if we wage war successfully, using all of these means against our adversaries abroad, through offensive military action and economic and financial tools and so on, the problem of securing the homeland will be made less. But it behooves us, I believe, to make our homeland as resilient against attack as possible, because we're sitting ducks. This is an open society with many opportunities for people who wish to do us harm to inflict such harm, and we need to make that as difficult as we can for them. There are three areas that we think can contribute measurably to making America more secure at home. The first is in giving our law enforcement and intelligence community the tools they need to try to protect. Instruments like the Patriot Act are hugely important in providing the community of people whose job it is to defend us here at home against our adversaries the means by which to do that. It's very heartening that this has now been reenacted, despite some fevered opposition. We need to be continuously monitoring whether there are additional tools that could usefully be applied, especially as we witness around the world the evidence of the determination of our enemies to exploit similar vulnerabilities elsewhere, notably in the subway system of London, for example, and in Canada, in Australia, in Spain, in Morocco, and so on. The same applies here. As we saw in 9/11, the tools need to be given to the law enforcement community to protect us. Another tool, by the way, is, I believe, the sorts of efforts that the National Security Agency has been making to monitor I think most accurately can be described as the battlefield communications of our enemies. It just happens that some of those enemies happen to be in this country, and therefore monitoring those phone calls, those emails, those faxes between Al-Qaeda operatives and others and people in this country is a critically important tool to protecting the homeland. A second subcategory in the Homeland Security Department involves something we call protecting against the mega threat you never heard of. For a long time, people familiar with nuclear weapons phenomena have understood that a nuclear weapon creates intense reactions, of course, blast effects as being one, thermal effects being another. One less understood is intense bursts of electromagnetic energy. Some have estimated them to be on the order of 1 million times the power of the most powerful radio signal on Earth. Were an adversary to detonate a nuclear weapon high in space over the United States, this so-called electromagnetic pulse effect, E.M.P., could rain down upon the United States from coast to coast, wiping out our electrical grid and damaging, if not destroying, electronic devices that have not been shielded against it. A Blue Ribbon Commission chartered by the Congress to evaluate this danger 2 years ago concluded that the effects of such an attack upon a society like ours could be truly catastrophic. To give you a sense of this, it could transform a 21st century society, a superpower, built upon this kind of electrical-driven, computer-enabled military and civilian economy. transforming that 21st century society into a pre-industrial age in the blink of an eye. There are a number of things that we know we can do to try to mitigate the danger that a country like Iran, which, by the way, seems not only to understand and be very aware of this phenomenon, this electromagnetic pulse threat, but also seems to be working to not only acquire the nuclear weapons, but the ballistic missiles with which to deliver them to space, perhaps for the purpose of, as President Ahmadinejad has said, bringing about a world without America. The three things that we can do to try to make sure that that doesn't happen. One is to try to deter any such attack. I believe that requires us to have and maintain an effective, credible, modern, safe nuclear force of our own. But there are countries, and Iran may be an example of it, in which the deterrent effect may not be all that we want it to be. After all, President Ahmadinejad has talked about bringing back the 12th Mahdi, a messianic figure that they anticipate will usher in the golden age of Islam worldwide. The triggering effect for which would be, according to this minority view in the Shiite tradition, the apocalypse. So deterring someone who hopes to bring about the apocalypse and thereby some sort of messianic return is not necessarily something you can bank on. So the second thing we need to do is to ensure that we've got missile defenses that can intercept and prevent ballistic missiles from being used to detonate such attacks that could have catastrophic effects on our country. And finally, as a nation, as a mobilized nation, as a nation truly on a war footing, we have to appreciate that we have to take steps, some of which will be time-consuming, some of which will be expensive, but nonetheless, steps that can harden our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure, against the effects of an electromagnetic pulse attack. It's way late to be beginning such a process, but we need to get about it right away. The third subset in the category of Homeland Security is, if you're going to try to secure America, obviously, you have to secure its borders. You have to have, to the maximum extent possible, understanding of who is in this country and ensure that people who are not here illegally are encouraged not to be here, or are incarcerated, or are in other ways ensured of not being a threat to this nation. In war footing, we recommend a number of steps, starting with building a fence immediately along the southern border of the United States, through which most of an invasion, frankly, of illegal immigrants occurs day in and day out. Until that fence gets constructed across the length of that 2,000-mile border, possible exception of some truly impassable places, we need to have military forces, and I believe they should be active duty forces, not just guard and reserve people, not just people who are doing clerk duty to free up Border Patrol personnel, but active duty military personnel with the requisite sensors and mobility capabilities to ensure that this invasion is stopped. That is, after all, the first responsibility of the United States military, to protect this country against invasion. Beyond that, there are a number of things that need to be done, many of which are now under debate in Washington, to ensure that dysfunctional aspects of our immigration policy are corrected. Things like giving people the opportunity to come to this country on a visa lottery basis. We know that some of these people have come into this country on that basis, have been terrorists. There are clearly other things that we need to do to understand better who are applying for visas, who are overstaying their visas, and ensuring that we're not, in fact, running the risk that such people will cause us mortal peril, rather than simply try to perform useful employment and work functions. Let me emphasize that the point of building a fence along the southern border of the United States, using our military forces to secure that border, and for that matter, work much more aggressively to secure, through various means, the northern border as well, is not to keep people in this country. This is not the Berlin Wall. It's to protect this country from invasion by people from outside. In addition to efforts to secure the borders, we clearly also need to address the interior of our country's problems with the dysfunctional immigration policies that have operated for many years. There are a number of things that we can do to try to ensure workforce laws are enforced, to tighten up visa application and monitoring procedures and the like. Common sense steps, some of which are being discussed as part of reforms in Washington, but all of which need to be aggressively thought through and, where appropriate, adopted to make this country more secure at home. The third category of instruments we believe need to be brought to bear by a mobilized America as part of our effort to win the war for the free world are what we call political warfare techniques. Ronald Reagan was a genius at the art of political warfare. Partly it's because he had practiced, as have indeed many of us, for years against our domestic adversaries. In fact, political warfare is just another way of describing the sorts of techniques and tools that we use every day in a democracy. As one party or one ideological movement or another tries to discredit its opponents, tries to advantage itself, strengthen its ability to exercise power and control, move the country or at least their movement in a direction that they prefer. We need to apply these same tools to a far greater degree than we are today to our enemies abroad. Indeed, I believe, as Ronald Reagan very well understood, that working against the legitimacy of dangerous totalitarian regimes, Islamofascist or otherwise, he did it with, of course, the Soviet Union, and successfully, by bringing to bear not just political warfare, but all of these techniques, managed to accomplish this, for many people, unthinkable, namely the destruction of the Soviet Union. A similar sort of approach, I think, can have very similar and very salutary effects on dangerous regimes that are with us today. We need to understand those regimes, the vulnerabilities they have to political warfare, the strengths that we can bring to bear in the form of political warfare, and then apply those techniques to, for example, bring about an end to one of the present serious threats we face from the regime in Iran, specifically by working with the people of Iran who hate it at least as much as we do, who want to be free of it at least as much as we would want them to be, and who I believe have no use for the support of terror against America and its friends, who I believe have no particular desire to bring about the apocalypse, and therefore would not represent the sort of peril that a nuclear-armed mullahocracy in Iran would constitute to us. Political warfare should, and I think can be used, not least because if we don't use such instruments, we are almost certainly going to have to use military force in due course against such regimes once the threat they pose to us metastasizes even further. And history teaches us that dealing with such dangerous regimes sooner rather than later is better, much less costly, much less dangerous, potentially for millions of people around the globe. Finally, we cluster under the rubric of diplomatic tools several subcategories. Diplomacy itself, of course, diplomacy being one thing that we have practiced for a long time. Unfortunately, I believe, at least in recent years, not terribly effectively, in terms especially of advancing this country's interests A second subcategory involves the United Nations, one of the principal players today in the world of international diplomacy. And a third deals with a sort of related discipline, namely the academy. What is being taught in our schools, particularly the people who need regional skills and knowledge and language skills and an awareness of cultures that are of direct relevance to this war for the free world. Let me talk about each of these in turn briefly. The problem we have, I think, at root in terms of our diplomacy has to do a lot with the mindset of people in our own State Department. People who represent a tradition, people who represent an industry, if you will, rooted in the idea that what we always should do is negotiate. No matter how dangerous they are, no matter what their intentions may be, it's always better, according to this sort of theory, to negotiate, to talk, to engage jaw, I think, as Winston Churchill once put it, being better than war. Unfortunately, it is not always true. Specifically, we've got the situation today of Iran, where we are currently hoping we will be able to talk Iran out of its nuclear weapons ambitions. Indeed, that we will reward them with all kinds of inducements if they'll only give up an objective they have been seeking, these mullahs, for the better part of 20 years. I'm convinced that the cost to the United States in negotiating with such a regime is to prevent us from trying to use political warfare instruments against them, to delegitimate them, to work with the Iranian people to bring about the end of this regime. The regime becomes, by definition, a partner in a diplomatic process that makes all of those things no longer possible. That, in turn, surely translates into a more dangerous Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, I'm convinced, and one that we will then have no choice down the road but to wage war against, and almost certainly do so under far more dangerous and difficult circumstances than those today. Personnel changes in sort of the mindset of the State Department is, accordingly, one of the things I believe America needs to do as part of its war footing stance. Secondly, we need to understand that the United Nations is not on our side. For many years, we have invested in the United Nations in the belief that, as its framers had in mind, it would be an instrument for promoting peace and protecting freedom-loving people around the world. In fact, it has proven to be, over time, rather consistently, instead, a protector of despots and tyrants and totalitarians. And to the extent that we continue to invest both legitimacy and confidence, to say nothing of hopes for our security in the United Nations, we are sure to be not only sorely disappointed, but I believe probably put at far greater peril as the tyrants and dictators and so on use that instrument much more effectively and very much against our interests. Accordingly, we believe an America on a war footing should be an America that marginalizes the United Nations. In fact, we argue in our book that we should instead be working to develop an alternative to the United Nations, comprised exclusively of freedom-loving nations, people who share our values, people who genuinely want to promote peace and expand the circle of free people around the world. People with whom, in short, we have very much in common and with whom we can surely work to accomplish the security and survival, indeed, of the free world. I call this alternative organization, for want of a better term, the free nations. And it's high time, I believe, that we get about developing such an alternative to the United Nations, both as a means of marginalizing the UN and of giving us real vehicles with which to work to our common interests. Finally, there's the academy. Those of us who have children of college age know that There are many in academic do not have a high regard for the United States, for its values, for its policies, certainly for its government. They're entitled to that view. I think it is part of academic freedom, indeed, that people who have those views are every bit as much afforded the opportunity to express them, to convey them, to debate them. Where we have a distinct problem, however, I believe, is where U.S. taxpayers are being asked to commit on the order of $120 million a year to academic institutions for the purposes of pursuing and enabling people to acquire regional skills, language training, and cultural insights that are of direct relevance to the places that we find ourselves engaging all over this world in our fight with the Islamofascists and their friends. To have people who are hostile to the United States, who do not subscribe to our values, who believe that our policies are the problem, not part of the solution, that hold in such contempt our government, are assuredly not communicating the right sorts of approaches and insights and mindset, I would argue, that we need for people who we hope will bring these regional skills, language, and so on to bear on behalf of surviving this country and freeing us from the threats that we face today and possibly tomorrow. So, encouraging in academia, at least in those areas of direct relevance to the war for the free world, a greater appreciation that the people that are the products of these academic institutions and training must not only know how to speak Urdu and Farsi and Chinese and Arabic, but they must also appreciate that they are being asked to bring those skills to bear on behalf of a great nation who needs and frankly requires their services and in whose service they should be proud to be. So with all these points, I hope we've given you a sense of not only the challenges that we face in this current global conflict. We've made it clear that this is not just about Iraq, or Iraq and Afghanistan even. This is certainly not going to be solved by losing in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is not just a military problem. It is not just a problem of a clash of civilizations. There is a lot of misunderstanding, and I hope that what we've described today lends itself to an appreciation that we are indeed confronting, yet again, a totalitarian ideology bent on the destruction of the free world, rooted in this case in what I think is most accurately described as Islamofascism, enabled by a variety of countries with different attitudes and policies and traditions, but a common antipathy towards us, and against whom we can and must bring to bear, to a far greater degree than we have so far, the native abilities and talents and resources of the American people. And I'm convinced that if America does indeed adopt, as it should, a war footing, if it does in fact implement as soon as possible the sorts of policies and tools and techniques that we're talking about in war footing, not only will America be a more secure place for this generation and for future ones, but I think the free world as a whole will indeed prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, for this insightful blueprint for success in the war for the free nations. We make all this information available on our website, democracyunderattack.org, where you can access these videos to help your own dynamic presentations. Everything you need to educate your group is included. The film Obsession, the question and answer session by Frank Gaffney, Frank's book, War Footing, The 10 Steps America Must Take to Win the War for the Free World, his tutorial video describing the 10 steps, our email newsletter, access to our online archives for your research, and a list of other relevant resources. These online tools can help you deliver this message to your friends, either at small, intimate gatherings or at larger community events. Go to democracyunderattack.org and help to preserve our freedoms before it's too late.